Everybody, my name is Patrick Graham, one of the organisers of the Liverpool Black Men's Group, and we've been putting on a week of events, well almost a week of events since Sunday, and this is the final event where we'll have Dr Ama Biney talking to us tonight, a historian from the University of Liverpool, a historian on African history, British history and Caribbean history. And tonight's talk is going to be on mainly the mistreatment of asylum seekers by the British and the Windrush scandal, as it's been commonly called. But just to thank you all for coming out on a wet, bit of windy winter's night. Not always easy to get people out on a night like that. Hope you've enjoyed the talk and you'll have plenty of questions afterwards, because there'll be a bit of a Q&A at the end of it. But again, thank you. I'll shut up now, because if you leave me, Dr Biney will never get a chance to say anything, and I will end up taking over the whole talk. So thank you very much, Dr Biney.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Can you hear me? Great. Thank you, Patrick, for that introduction. Thank you to the Liverpool Black Men's Group for inviting me to host this event. The last time I was in the presence of the Black Men's Group, I gate crashed it without knowing that I had done so. Thank you. So yes, thank you. You're going to have to bear with me, because I was telling one or two people that I'm a very early riser, and so I'm shutting down, or my energy levels kind of really dip around this time. I'm up around 6 o'clock, in work at 8 o'clock. So, forgive me, but I'm going to do my best. So, I want to kind of correct perhaps a perception, because somebody I was talking to, one of the organisers here, in terms of the title of my presentation, Britain's History of Mistreating Asylum Seekers in the Windrush Generation, and she asked me, so you're a lawyer? And I said, no. So I'm not doing anything from a legal perspective. I'm a historian, and my emphasis on kind of political and social history. So in terms of the latest legal issues around asylum seekers and the Windrush Generation, I cannot go into great depth in regards to those issues. Perhaps some of you are more learned than I am on those fronts. But, okay, what's happening here?
With the left lock button?
Yes, that's what I'm going to use. This cartoon, I like little cartoons because they kind of reflect my humour. When I saw this on WhatsApp, and if you can't see it, the big bubble, what are the 4 countries of the United Kingdom? It's British citizenship lessons, and the person seated at the desk says, England, Scotland, Wales and Rwanda. And that really summarises some of the points that I'm seeking to make in today's lecture. So, as we know, it was in April this year that Priti Patel, then Home Secretary, announced the government's plan to deport asylum seekers to Rwanda. And this announcement really led me to think about not just the mistreatment of asylum seekers, but also the Windrush Generation and how they've been institutionally, callously regarded and treated, and to make parallels between asylum seekers and consider the parallels between asylum seekers and the Windrush Generation. So that's what kind of motivated me to start thinking about those two experiences. And I began to think that these two experiences are really deeply rooted in very cruel policies of indignity and dehumanization, but they have to be understood within a historical context. And I believe, or I'm putting out there, that this historical context can go back to 1596, remember that date, and also 1787, the Sierra Leone resettlement scheme, remember that date. We'll come back to that in my lecture. So let's start from the present and go back in time. It's widely accepted that the Windrush scandal first was exposed in 2017 during the government of Theresa May. And for me personally, it was profoundly shocking. As somebody who teaches Black British history, and particularly, the Windrush Generation, post-war migration, and Black presence going back thousands of years to Roman times, the treatment of the Windrush Generation I found was, institutionally callous at a profound, phenomenal level. Because, as we all know, it was revealed that thousands of Commonwealth citizens, many of whom were the Windrush Generation, had been wrongly detained. They had been denied their legal rights, and some of them had been deported. And basically they'd had their whole lives disrupted, upheavals by a deeply flawed, discriminatory immigration system. And we can ask ourselves, why did this Windrush scandal come to light? What were the causes of it? And some people have argued that the origins of it go back to the David Cameron government of 2010 to 2016, when in 2012 Cameron introduced immigration policies that tasked the National Health Service, landlords and employers to become essentially kind of immigration officers, to enforce immigration controls, to make sure that your tenants have the legal right to remain in this country, and employers as well. And the intention was to really push out illegal immigrants, but really what it did was it harassed legal migrants who had a right to stay in this country. And this was on the basis that this government was zealously committed to implementing a policy, measures that would cut what was considered to be high net migration into Britain. And the government, the right-wing government, believed that they had the policies to deal with these problems. However, the reality is that many of the Windrush Generation children, they arrived on their parents' passports. And the Home Office had destroyed thousands of their landing cards and other documents. And therefore, many lacked the documentation to prove that they had the right to remain in this country. And then, the audacity of it, the Home Office then turned around and demanded that these Windrush Generation individuals should present at least one official documentation for every year that they had lived in the UK. And this proved, an impossible burden for many people who had basically done nothing wrong. And so, in 2013, Theresa May was then Home Secretary, and she approved vans clad with the question, in the UK illegally, go home or face arrest. These massive billboards went up and down parts of the country. I was in London then and saw this on the television and in newspapers, screaming to all black and brown people, go home or face arrest. And essentially, such messages, really exacerbated, the hostile environment. They sent a message to black and brown people that they were unwelcome, irrespective of whether they were documented or not. They were an unwanted presence. And it also gave the green light to neo-fascist groups and neo-fascist thinking. And there was actually a spike in racial attacks. And again, I recall, because I tend to avidly try as much as possible to follow current affairs in newspapers, I remember there was an attack in Hammersmith. A Polish man was killed, which, you know, deeply alarmed, you know, sections of the community, activist community. And this was as a result of xenophobia, you know, hate crime. So this whipping up of anti-immigrant fervour was directed also at Eastern European people. And let's not forget that this hostile environment was also emboldened by Nigel Farage's UKIP party at the time, and as well the 2016 Brexit votes that took Britain out of the European Union. And again, let's put this within an international context of what was happening across the Atlantic pond. 2015, if we recall, Donald Trump got into office, and his anti-immigrant, you know, sentiments and policies, you know, were very blatant, were very open. He stereotyped particularly Mexicans and dubbed them all as rapists. And he also vowed, though in his 4 years in office, the wall was never built. He wanted to build a wall to keep the Mexicans out. And then, again, if we recall his policies in terms of stopping Mexicans coming into America, separated, there were appalling images on the television, again very distressing, seeing Mexicans, families separated from their children. So all of this I paint as you know, a picture showing a rising anti-immigrant, xenophobic atmosphere, context in Britain nationally, and also reflected internationally as well, in Europe as well, neo-fascist right-wing groups. So, under Theresa May as Home Secretary, illegal deportations continued, and they also continued when she was Prime Minister between 2016 and 2019. And some people were deported to countries they had not seen since they were children. For example, Sylvester Marshall, he had lived in this country for 44 years. He contracted cancer, was in hospital, and he was presented with a bill from the NHS to the sum of £54,000. It was as a result of pressure, you know, publicity and pressure campaigning that this bill was rescinded. There was also the case of Richard Anwar, which also indicates that the Windrush scandal was not just confined to African Caribbeans or West Indians, but it also affected Richard Anwar, who was born in Britain of Ghanaian ancestry, 52 years old. He was an upholsterer by trade profession, and he made the mistake of going to Ghana in 2016 for his father's funeral. 2 weeks, he thought, you know, a family visit to bury his father. He ended up staying in Ghana, destitute, for 2.5 years, because when he sought to return to Britain, he was denied re-entry. And after 2.5 years, being destitute on the streets of Ghana, he finally returned. You can read this in a very good article by the journalist Amelia Gentleman on The Guardian's long read. That's where I discovered this story. And finally, he was allowed re-entry into the country at the time when the Windrush scandal hit. And he's now seeking compensation, along with thousands of other Windrush Generation citizens. He's one of at least 13,000 people who are seeking compensation as a result of them being misclassified as immigration offenders. So he is one of two people, black citizens, who've been treated, you know, very inhumanely by the British government. Then came Priti Patel as Home Secretary in 2019, and you know, she waded in with determination and purpose, and as Professor Gus John is an education consultant, a campaigner, an activist. He's written on this and many other issues around the Windrush scandal and Windrush Generation in the Jamaican Gleaner. And he has argued, and I quote him here, he says, not only did she, Priti Patel, ensure that the pain and suffering continued, she made it even more difficult for hostile environment victims to get the compensation they were due. End of quote. So she introduced the policy of sending anyone seeking to gain entry into Britain to be, you know, sent to Rwanda, and this caused, you know, a huge backlash and moral condemnation from many charity groups, and the Refugee Council being in the forefront, as well as the clergy of this country. And the clergy in particular, one of them denounced or characterized this policy as, quote, state-sponsored trafficking, which essentially, you know, what it is. And even the new King Charles III has even called the policy, quote, appalling. Now, if we look at, you know, the heritage of Priti Patel, it's no secret knowledge that she is the daughter of Ugandan Indian immigrants. And this, again, around the time of April, May on WhatsApp, you can see I follow some WhatsApp conversations quite closely. This was being circulated, which again, I think it captures sentiments out there. Somebody said, wondering why Priti Patel's family came to live in the UK when they could have made a far shorter journey from Uganda into nearby Rwanda. And the question I would ask is, you know, would Priti Patel go to Rwanda to live if she was an asylum seeker today? You know, bearing in mind that her heritage, she's of Ugandan, Indian heritage. Because her parents fled from Uganda, particularly to avoid the deportation of Idi Amin in Uganda, who was ruling Uganda in the late 70s at that time. So to move on, I've briefly sketched the current reality of a very heinous treatment of the Windrush Generation, and coming on the wake of that has been Priti Patel's policy to, or the government's policy to send asylum seekers to have their applications processed in Rwanda. And Priti Patel, she described the scheme as, quote, a world-class migration partnership, end of quote. And she said that it would, quote, break the business model of the people smuggling gangs and help fix the broken asylum system, end of quote. Now I wish to argue that there's been a much longer hostile environment towards black and brown people in this country, and we can scrutinize history, and the hostile environment actually goes back, you know, hundreds of years ago. And I would argue that it was created on the 11th of July 1596, when Queen Elizabeth I wrote a letter to the Lord Mayor of London requesting those kind of people should be deported. And whilst I should actually have prefaced that and said that I would agree rather with Peter Fryer, who cites this in his book, that it was Queen Elizabeth I to refer to those kind of people as blackamoors, people of African heritage descent. They should be deported. And the reason being is that at the time, the population of England was, according to Peter Fryer, roughly around 3 million people, and there had been a series of bad harvests in the country. And she argued that these blackamoors were taking food out of her subjects' mouths. So there was, a shortage of food, and as what political interests do, the ruling class do, they scapegoat. So in 1596, this attempt to deport black people actually failed, and again in 1601, she issued another proclamation to banish black people from her kingdom, and it also failed. Now, it was the rise of the transatlantic slave trade and Britain's involvement in it, which began initially, as a trickle, very gradually, slowly in the 1560s, to Britain becoming, a key player in the 1650s onwards. And as we all know, Liverpool played a very central role in that horrific trafficking of Africans. And that engagement led to some black people coming to this country. And so across the country, from Devon to Kent and in various English cities, such as London, Bristol and Liverpool, we see enslaved Africans as domestic servants alongside other trades. But it was the American War of Independence, fought from 1775 to 1783, that led to some black people coming across the Atlantic to this country. The numbers increased, particularly in the 1780s, as a result of enslaved blacks being promised freedom on the condition that they fought for Britain on the British side during the war. And the historian Christopher Fife, he points out that aside from these black loyalists, quote, sailors stranded at the end of a voyage also swelled the African population, end of quote. Now, these black loyalists had been promised their freedom, as I said, if they fought on the British side, and Britain honoured her promise, and therefore, during the 1780s, there was a stream of penniless, destitute refugees, black migrants who came from America to Britain. And by mid-1786, there were at least 1,144 of them, known as the Black Poor, living in London. And they lived cheek by jowl alongside a group of East Indian seamen who were known as the Lascars. And they also received kind of racial abuse. They were also vulnerable, they were poor, they had been working for the East India Company, and they had become unemployed and had not been given, gratuities or pensions when they had finished their employment stint with the company. And so, in early 1786, a committee of gentlemen was set up, made up of these three groups, bankers, merchants and MPs, to provide relief for the distressed Lascars. So it was initially the Lascars that caught the attention of the ruling classes, the government. And Christopher Fife says that initially this committee of gentlemen was able to raise around £800 in terms of relief in the first few months. And then the committee extended this relief to the Black Poor, and the numbers grew to around 320 people. The committee then rebranded itself, changed its name, and became known as the Committee for the Relief of the Black Poor. And it raised money by appealing for public donations for the public to contribute. And it was distributing food to these destitute people, such as broth, a piece of meat, and a loaf of bread. And it was, in terms of its catchment of numbers, it was about up to 140 people a day. And I'd like you to hold that point in your mind in terms of, relief being given to the Lascars and the Black Poor by this committee in 1786. relief food donations. And cast your minds today, now, currently, we have seen in the last 5 years a number of food banks increase across this country, giving relief to working people, working class people who are working but still can't, make ends meet and provide food on the tables. So, these food banks of 1786 have some parallels to the food banks of today. Perhaps today, they now cater for people from diverse ethnic backgrounds. So, from around February 1786, the numbers receiving relief from the Committee for the Relief of the Black Poor increased to around 210 people a day. And they were being issued this relief from 2 public houses in London. One was based in the East End of London, around Mile End Green, and another in West London, around Paddington. And the committee also opened what was called at the time a sick house, today would be called hospital. And this hospital was based in central London, Warren Street, and it was seeing between 40 to 50 people a day, and mainly black people, black and brown people, and the type of diseases that they were suffering from was TB and respiratory illnesses, because, black people were essentially unused to the very severe cold, damp weather, so it was a reflection on their health, and some of them became gravely ill. Now, by April 1786, the committee had given relief to around 460 people, and their money was running out. Money or relief was given to people of around 6 shillings a day, and numbers seeking relief also grew. And these are just a few numbers from Peter Fryer. So we can see the increase: 364 people in June 1786. In August, it almost doubles to 622. And then in early September, 736. By the end of September, it soars to 1,000 people. And it was the British government that contributed the lion's share of this money for the Committee for the Relief of the Black Poor, because it was eager to solve the problem of the black poor. But then, what emerged was a scheme to resettle the black poor in the country that we now know as Sierra Leone. And the idea was coined by one very eccentric amateur botanist and elocution teacher by the name of Henry Sneedman. And he became the agent or the superintendent, the coordinator of the scheme, and he was appointed by the committee. So in terms of interests or the supporters of the Sierra Leone settlement scheme, we can analyse at least 3 converging interests. Henry Sneedman was very clear on what his ulterior motives were. They were to make money. And in addition to him were 2 London merchants who also saw it as an opportunity to invest in large-scale cotton production. But as Christopher Fife points out, he argues, quote, they were uninterested in the settlers, end of quote. And then the last kind of interest or motivation was from the British anti-slavery campaign of Granville Sharp, who really had very utopian ambitions to kind of set up some puritanical, religious, Christian society, model society in Africa. But one historian by the name of Mary Norton, she points out that Granville Sharp was to become involved in the project in later years. His role in 1786 was very much peripheral. However, some of the black poor did approach Granville Sharp and asked him for his advice as to whether they should go to Sierra Leone or not. But the point that we should consider is that in regards to all these interests and parties, no one thought to consider to consult the black poor themselves as to what they wanted, what they needed. Their interests, their agendas, ambitions were completely sidelined. Now, Smeedman, who was the instigator, who coined the whole idea to resettle the black poor in Sierra Leone, he lobbied both the Treasury and the Committee for the Relief of the Black Poor. And he convinced them that the only solution was his proposal. That was the way forward. And it was necessary to relieve the country of the black poor on a permanent basis by resettling them in Sierra Leone. And the Treasury agreed to pay Smeedman for every emigrant who boarded the ship. The Treasury agreed to pay Smeedman £14 per immigrant. So that was the agreement. And therefore a PR campaign was set up by the committee, initially in the form of a handbill telling the black poor that the grain coast of Africa would provide them with a comfortable living and a comfortable life. And Christopher Fife argues that Smeedman, quote, painted a land of immense fertility, perfectly healthy for those who live temperately, where the soil need only be scratched with a hoe to yield grain in abundance. So the question we can ask ourselves is, what did the black poor think of this scheme? In short, very much like the Rwanda policy, or asylum seekers of today, being told that they would be sent to Rwanda, flown to Rwanda, 4,000 miles away. The black poor, they were not convinced, and they were not interested. But more importantly, they were harder to persuade, largely because the entire West African coast, and particularly the Sierra Leone coast, was rife. It was notorious for slave trading. And so they were naturally fearful, naturally apprehensive. However, Christopher Fife also points out that the project had, quote, attracted African domestic servants stirred by the vision of returning to their ancestral home, as well as destitute loyalists and sailors. However, Smeedman, who was the agent superintendent in charge of this scheme, he had two things in his favour. One, he had a very persuasive tongue. He was able to sell the project. And two, he also had control of the relief money. But however, he died very unexpectedly in July 1786. And with his death, there was a talk of switching the place of resettlement from Sierra Leone to the Bahamas, a place that was equally rife with slavery. And this obviously, again, caused a great deal of uneasiness amongst the black poor. And the historian Mary Norton, she points out that the black poor continued to insist upon a written guarantee of their freedom, which was eventually agreed upon as a condition for receiving the daily sixpence allowance. Then another destination, apart from the Bahamas, was followed by New Brunswick, Canada. But yet again, the black poor, they were not convinced, they were not seduced. And then in around mid-August 1786, the Treasury agreed to the revival of the Sierra Leone settlement scheme with Smeedman's successor, a man by the name of Joseph Irwin. And the committee now, that is the Committee for the Relief of the Black Poor, now issued a proclamation which was very threatening to the black poor. They were told that if they were found to be begging or lurking on the streets, action would be pursued against them under the Vagrancy Act. And Peter Fryer says, quote, "A fortnight before Christmas," and that's in 1786, "the committee asked the public to suspend giving alms to the black poor in order to induce them to comply with the engagement they had entered into." So again, we can see some of the very unscrupulous, morally repugnant actions on the part of the committee, actually telling the public not to give charity or alms to destitute people because they should be sent to Africa. And even in early 1787, the London Lord Mayor also ordered marshals and constables to round up any black people they saw begging on the streets and to bring them before the magistrates because they had a place to go, and that place was Africa. And essentially the reality is that the black poor, they were reluctant to board the ships. And this is because some of them had caught sight of Australia-bound convict ships on the River Thames. And so they saw these ships being loaded with, white convicts who were going to be shipped off to Australia. And this obviously, scared them, frightened them. And their fears were also heightened by very sensationalist newspaper reports, writings at the time. But finally, after much, cajoling, threatening, enticing, through the 6 shillings a day, a convoy left England for Australia, and it was made up of around 374 black settlers. However, Christopher Pye puts the number at 411, and among them were some black women and also white women. And the voyage lasted about a month, 4 weeks, and during the voyage, 35 of them died. Now, what became of these 374 black people? According to Peter Fryer, and I have a quote from him, quite a lengthy quote, but forgive me, but I think it really summarises the point, the argument. And he says, quote, "The later history of these settlers is one of disaster piled on disaster. They died like flies. Some were sold to French slave traders. The seeds they had brought from England would not grow in a tropical climate. Caught in the three-way crossfire of a conflict involving an American slave ship, a British man of war, and a local ruler, the settlers were given 3 days to leave their little town, and it was burned to the ground. After 4 years, only 60 were left of the 374 who arrived." End of quote. Now, a local chief by the name of King Jimmy destroyed the town in what the historian Vincent Carretta characterises as, quote, "misdirected retaliation for the abduction of some of his people by a United States slave trader," end of quote. Another historian by the name of Mary Morton, she argues that the Sierra Leone scheme fell because the British government essentially, quote, "wanted to rid the nation of what they regarded as pestilence influence," end of quote. It failed essentially because the British government wanted to get rid of a group of people that it considered to be an eyesore, and a group of people that it despised. There were some African voices and critics of this scheme. In the forefront of the critics was the Fanti, the Ghanaian anti-slavery campaigner by the name of Ottobah Kubuwano, and he came out and publicly condemned the scheme, and he identified the real failure for the colony in his renowned book, Thoughts and Sentiments. It's a very long-winded title, but for brevity, thoughts and sentiments. And he says that the organisers of the scheme had never prepared, quote, any prudent and right plan, end of quote. And he's correct. There was never any, serious, careful, genuine, systematic, carefully considered plan that involved, that centred around the needs of the black poor. It was entirely disingenuous from the beginning. Lord Equiano, he had been appointed by the Navy Board in 1786 as commissary on the part of government, and one of his roles was to look after the dispersal of the supplies, and he also acted as official representative of the British government in its dealings with the local African authorities. However, Equiano was very forthright and found out that Joseph Irwin had been, in his opinion, treating the black poor very disrespectfully, treating the black poor in the same way that white people treat black people in the West Indies, is what he said. And also Irwin, according to Equiano, was misappropriating and abusing the provisions. But there was also an issue that there was an overlap between the role of Equiano and that of Joseph Irwin, who was the Asian superintendent in charge of the project, which soon developed into conflict between the two. And Equiano leaked information to the newspaper, the Morning Herald, in which he's accused of undermining the confidence in the project, because Equiano accused Irwin of being, quote, a villain. So therefore, Equiano was dismissed from his position in March 1787, and he made this conflict known to his good friend, Ottimo Kubuano, when he published in the Public Advertiser, Equiano, he complained of his mistreatment, and he defended his conduct. And he was accused by his detractors of stirring the blacks to mutiny, which he naturally denied. Now, to conclude, the British government had basically succeeded in getting rid of 374 black men and women in April 1787, in a case that I think needs to be retrieved from historical obscurity. Mary Norton points out that, quote, the problem was, of course, that neither the Black Poor Committee nor the Lords of the Treasury had made any serious commitment to helping the Sierra Leone settlement scheme achieve success, and that lapse was to prove fatal, end of quote. So they were got rid of, and after 4 years, many of them had died. They had indeed been duped into thinking that they would lead comfortable lives on the great coast of Africa. They were led to believe that once they dug the soil, it would be flourishing with agricultural yield. Likewise, I think prospective asylum seekers being sent to Rwanda, they're also being sold a lie that their human rights will be protected in a country that has seen, killings, detentions, people being disappeared, political opposition is not allowed to exist in Rwanda. Rwanda has a very dubious record on human rights towards its own people, let alone people coming into the country. So, the first Sierra Leone settlement scheme can clearly be seen as a scheme that, with the complicity of the British government, was about ethnically cleansing London, in particular, cleansing the streets of London of the black poor. And it was essentially state-sponsored trafficking. And to jump once again into the present, some journalists have written that what rich countries are now doing is they're trying to offshore their problems, particularly their immigration problems, to developing countries. For example, Australia has in the past tried to offshore its immigration policies to the islands of Manus and Nauru. That is essentially dumping unwanted people by using third countries as processing centres for asylum seekers. And what many people are not aware of is that some such schemes have not only proved to be unsuccessful, they've also proved to be very expensive. That's something we don't hear about in the media. Now, in short, Britain's history of mistreating asylum seekers and the Windrush has consistently had its roots in, sometimes very polite, very English, British contempt, I would say, for the other, which I think Queen Elizabeth and her disdainful reference to those kind of people really exemplifies, well, I see that as the epitome of a British contempt, a British disdain that despises the racialised other. And I would argue that what we need to do is we need to create a new world, a new society, communities in which all human beings are treated with dignity, are treated with fairness, and are treated with genuine humanity, or what the South Africans call Ubuntu. We need to essentially create a world where all human beings and people of African descent genuinely matter. That is the world that we need to create. At that point, I will thank you all for listening.